Along our spiritual journey, as we see deeper and deeper into the nature of this reality, a common question that arises is, who the F is running this show? So today I'm going to be talking about who seems to be in charge of this realm, and at the end of this video, I will share with you how to exit the matrix and reclaim your power. Common phrases we hear within the spiritual and conscious community, such like, they don't want us to recognize our true power, or they don't want to see us in our spiritual sovereignty, and so forth, all seem to be referring to a cryptic and mystical they. And so then the question becomes, who is this mysterious they, and why do they hate us so much? So who they are is going to shift depending on which level of reality that we are addressing this at. Because ultimately, who they are emanates from a thought form that exists within creation. To understand what I mean about they being a thought form that emanates within creation, you can watch my video on exactly this topic titled, Greed is Not the Problem, This Is. So in understanding exactly who they are, first, the most important thing to understand is that they go by several names. Many, many names. And because of that, what one person is referring to in one light might be of the same nature or concept of what another person is referring to in another light. And so because of that, they are more nebulously known as the powers that be. However, at this stage in the game, a more accurate term would be the powers that were, as they no longer hold the same power or influence as they once did within the collective mind. So knowing that the powers that be ultimately is still a very abstract term, what we do is see how this manifests within this experience, and that's mainly through globalism. So we're seeing a lot of the powers that were force and influence on the global stage. These are the people who are trying to really push for a new world order. This is the cabal that has consolidated the world's banking system by destabilizing regions of the world. Its arms and legs are the military-industrial complex, as without that vessel, it would have no way of exerting its will onto humanity. So even just within the physical realm, they is multi-layered. When we go up a level of reality, they is no longer in a human form. At this level of reality, they are hyperdimensional, malevolent entities. All of these forces are a manifestation of a certain pathway within creation. And what this pathway is one that doesn't view itself within the other. This is what's known most commonly in the spiritual community as a service to self pathway. I don't really agree with the term service to self and service to others because that terminology can make a person very confused or think that self-love is narcissistic and selfish, when in reality, self-love is one of the strongest and most powerful lessons that we are ever faced with constantly and over again. But this pathway of service to self is not one that has anything to do with love. What it has to do instead with is a divided and separate consciousness. A consciousness that does not realize that it is connected to all, and therefore it only knows how to usurp power from others. Because it cannot see itself and feel itself within the other, it can create so much trauma and pain within our reality. And that is why it's called service to self. Not because it has self-love. In fact, it's devoid of self-love. It's devoid of love in general. Why it's called service to self is because it can only sense itself through itself. And because of that, that is very low consciousness, because that is a state of separation consciousness. And because it operates at such a low level of awareness, it's operating from service to self, which is survival mode. And because it's operating from survival mode, it's operating from the reptilian brain. Now in humans, this entity is manifested as our reptilian brain because our sensory organs need some sort of way of interpreting the vibrations and the waveforms of specific energy fields. And so our brain, which is the interface between us and reality, would have as a way to transduce the signal that we're receiving from this waveform state that we are perceiving as reptilian. So you see how this same energy will be represented and manifested in different ways depending on what level of reality it's interacting with. The best part is that doesn't even sum all of this up. But what we're looking at, essentially, are pathways within creation. And so if there is an evolutionary pathway, then by universal law, there must be its opposite, which is known as an involutionary pathway. And so what we know as these different forces manifested at different levels of being are known as the forces of involution. Because if evolution seeks to expand, to move away from self in exploration and discovery still of itself, but also within the universal flow or within the universal tide of moving outward within creation in order to enhance and develop itself further, then also there must be a pathway that moves inside, implodes within itself, but not in a very, like inward, meditative, positive state such as that, in a way where it seeks to hinder its own evolutionary ability, its own extension. And rather than expand and evolve, what it will do instead is contract. It's a contracting nature, is what involution is. And what it does is it stagnates. And so if evolution is to expand, develop, and grow, then involution in this case would be the mechanism that stops and hinders that process, that thwarts that ability for evolution. And that's why the most accurate context in order to see this pathway or they through is through the forces of involution, because they seek to deter, they seek to hinder and block our own evolutionary process. If awakening is a part of our natural spiritual evolution and consciousness, then involution is the force in creation that's trying to block our own awakening. From a larger perspective, one could say that we can only grow through the obstacles. In this case, we take a Zen approach to reality and say the obstacle, therefore, is the path. And in that light, we can look at this as a part of our natural and organic evolution and consciousness by needing to endure the trials and tribulations that will ultimately cultivate our higher consciousness. However, by anyone's standards, it'd be hard to justify the level of pain and separation that this reality holds. In this way, we can also see the forces of involution as a part of the collective consciousness, the portion that is called the shadow. And this is the portion of our reality that will take on the manifestations of that which has yet to be owned, aware, and awakened within our collective psyche. So there's different levels to this, especially when we're going to go all the way to the top where this thought form is emanating from. Because from the highest perception, they is the portion of source consciousness that has chosen to stay in a state of denial. Now, denial, when it's manifested in the many different ways that it can manifest throughout each level of reality, is going to look anywhere from psychopathy to extreme forms of nihilism. Because the metaphysical force of denial will still, no matter what, create and manifest, but now it's manifesting and creating from a state of repression, which is why the opposite of repression is healing, and why a healing journey is so important throughout a spiritual awakening, because it aligns us with our true essence, which is to evolve and to expand. Knowing that this reality will always experience varying degrees of its opposite, which is known as duality or polarity, then now we know that when there is evolution, there is ultimately its opposite, which is involution. Where there is light, there is dark. Where there is consciousness, there is unconsciousness. Where there is acceptance, evolution, and love, there is also denial and repression and pain. And so because of this, we know that at the highest level of reality, they is a negation. Because you cannot actually have darkness. What you can only have is light and the absence of light. And if you have the absence of light, what you have is actually negation. And so who they are at the highest level of being can be known as the forces of involution, denial, or negation. And how that plays out in this little old realm is by seeing portions of our collective consciousness absolutely devoid from their heart center and from their ability to see, feel, and sense themselves in the other. And that's how one can seek pleasure from torment and get energy from another person's suffering. Now, how we exit this matrix of they is through reclaiming our power. And in this context, that is done through consciousness and through cultivating joy and bliss. This is so important and esoteric that the Gnostics referred to joy as salvation, because that's how much your energy field is liberated from this reality when you're able to truly cultivate that state in a conscious and coherent way, not coming from a state of denial. If feeding off of trauma and suffering and pain is how this reality is sustained through separate selves, then cultivating joy is magnetic, attractive, and echoes outward into the ether and broadcasts itself into this reality. And what that does is elevate or ascend us into a higher dimensional version of this reality. So it's not necessarily like we need to stop paying attention to reality itself, because that would be a state of bypassing. Instead, what it is working within the framework of this reality to become conscious. And then with our choices that we make, actions that we take, and our ability to cultivate peace within and without our lives, what joy does and why mystics emphasized it is it's raising your level of frequency above the level of reality where it can be consumed on and preyed on. And that is exiting the matrix. I hope this has demystified who they are. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.